Who is this God who calls, who addresses us personally by name, and reveals to us his purposes for our lives? Using his voice to call is among God's most primitive acts. In Genesis, the very act of creation itself is cast as a series of name callings, of calling things this and that, and thereby into being, as when God calls the light day and the darkness night. God even involves Adam in the naming of the wild animals and birds of the air. In Eden, God calls Adam to his side following the fateful consumption of the forbidden fruit. The angel of the Lord calls out to Abraham, preventing him from sacrificing his son Isaac. God calls out to Jacob in a vision by night, and to Moses from the burning bush, and by less exotic means elsewhere. It is to God's voice that the prophets respond. In short, the God of Israel may be invisible, but he is hardly silent. The New Testament authors refer to Jesus as Kalin, the one who calls, and repeatedly to the Christian life as ekklesis, a calling. The first Christians were tellingly known simply as the kalumenoi, the ones who are called. They called their gathering together an ecclesia, the same word used in the Septuagint to translate the Hebrew kahal, referring to the assembly of God's chosen, which is to say the people of Israel, who, in virtue of their covenantal relationship with God, enjoyed special access to divine revelation, the same sort of access that Christians believe members of the true church presently enjoy. The Catechism of the Catholic Church invites us to imagine the people of Israel and the people of God as parallel. As the Jewish people gathered at Sinai before God to receive the law, so Catholics gather as church to receive the Eucharist. Of course, there is nothing unusual about a divine being who speaks, and God can use his voice to do things other than to call, as surely as he can reveal himself by means other than by calling. However, it is in and through calling them that the God of Israel reveals something distinctive about himself to his human creatures. The God who calls stands in marked contrast to the God who commands, on the one hand, and the God who makes polite requests, on the other. To be sure, to call does connote a sense of urgency, not apparent in a verb like to ask. A simple request or solicitation is more easily ignored than a call. There is presumably less at stake. That said, while at times the meaning of to call in English can overlap substantially with that of to command or to order, more typical in contemporary documents of the Church is the sense that a divine call is something to which one responds out of desire and hope, more than obligation or fear. Presumably a call from God, if it were truly from God, we should find to be ultimately persuasive, leading to decisive action. But how do we know that it really is God who is calling us? And how do we know that we have understood correctly what it is that God is calling for? What should it mean to hear the divine word in human language? Must the reception of God's word in the form of a call be accompanied by unusual or altered mental states associated with phenomena such as visions, trances, or speaking in tongues? The Theology of Vatican II accommodates the idea that divine revelation can, and often does, come wrapped in the container of a call, but it leaves largely to us the project of developing practices by which the content of the divine call might be critically assessed. In this inquiry, I contend that the vocational form in which God ordinarily reveals himself offers us a clue. It informs us as to how we ought to go about discerning the content of that revelation. These clues help us to interpret what exactly God is up to and calling for here and now from us. In other words, the formal characteristics of the divine call suggest norms for a practice of vocational discernment. In order to discern the formal characteristics of the divine call, however, we need first to step back, way back in fact, such that our most fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality itself come into view. In other words, we must step into the plane of metaphysics. In what follows, I contend that a compelling account of the Christian call follows from the adoption of a Platonic metaphysics, the fundamental presuppositions of which informed the formation of much of the biblical imagination itself. Whereas some would erect a wall between Jerusalem and Athens, I think this is a mistake. Hellenistic thought generally, and Platonic thought specifically, influenced the biblical authors, Old and New Testament alike, to say nothing of Jesus himself. We will have much to say about this, and about what exactly I mean by Platonism in what follows. The big idea, for now, is that in the absence of a well-formed Platonic imagination, one tends to understand the Christian call within the boundaries of the Epicurean imagination, the default position in much of contemporary society. From the point of view of the Epicurean imagination, the very idea of being called personally by God can only be hallucinatory, and the phenomena associated with hearing voices can only be understood as either miraculous or pathological, perhaps even bordering on madness. In neither case will the concept of a divine calling seem like the sort of idea upon which our understanding of the Christian life might safely rest. Yet the idea of calling is a centerpiece of the framework through which the early Christians did, in fact, view their lives. Thus, recovering the perspective from which one might view the Christian call as fundamental should be a priority for those who presume to practice a biblical and traditional faith.